Pause for a second and look at that photo again. Nothing about it has been touched up, retouched, or altered in any way. And that's exactly what makes it so fascinating. The Sound of Music has been adored by generations of viewers since it first hit theaters. Yet even the most polished, Oscar-winning productions leave behind little cracks in the illusion, if you know where to look. Today we're going to zoom in on 20 of those cracks, the slip-ups, the hidden truths, and the moments where reality quietly poked through the fairy tale. Grab a seat, because some of these might completely change how you see this beloved film. Julie Andrews stepped into the role of Maria as a trained singer and dancer, but the guitar was a different story entirely. She had barely touched one before cameras started rolling. Production brought in coaches to get her up to speed quickly, and while she managed the basic chords well enough, singing and strumming at the same moment turned out to be a genuine struggle. Actors on set later recalled that the pressure of the rolling cameras made those scenes tougher than they looked. To settle her nerves before some of the trickier guitar takes, Andrews reportedly leaned on a small glass of Austrian schnapps to loosen up. Christopher Plummer, playing the captain, put in his own hours of guitar and vocal coaching too, determined to do the songs justice. In the end, though, his singing voice and his guitar work never made it into the finished film. A professional musician was quietly brought in to record those parts, and it's their performance audiences have been hearing ever since. The rowboat tipping over on the lake is one of the film's more comedic beats, but behind the scenes, it briefly turned frightening. Kim Carruth, cast as the youngest Von Trapp child Gretel, had never learned to swim. When the boat capsized during filming, the entire cast tumbled into the water, and Julie Andrews, whose job it was to scoop up Gretel and steer her to safety, lost her footing and fell backward instead of catching the little girl in time. Carruth swallowed a significant amount of lake water in the chaos, and the shock of it made her sick almost immediately, unfortunately right onto Heather Menzies, who played her older sister Louisa. Everyone recovered fine, but it remains one of those set stories that sounds far scarier than anything that ended up on screen. Christopher Plummer's relationship with this project was famously rocky. He found the tone far too saccharine for his taste and wasn't shy about saying so. He took to calling it things like S and M, or joking that it was really the sound of mucus. His frustration with the shoot reportedly showed up in his appetite. He ate and drank more than usual to cope with a long, sentimental production, and gained enough weight along the way that the wardrobe department had to keep adjusting his costumes to fit. Interestingly, decades later Plummer softened considerably, admitting a real respect for how deeply the film resonated with audiences worldwide, even if it was never quite his cup of tea. That grand Von Trapp mansion in the film doesn't actually exist as one single building. The production stitched together two different structures, using one for exterior front shots and another for the back, while the interior rooms were entirely studio sets built in Hollywood. The iconic gazebo, where 16 Going on 17 was filmed, wasn't a real structure preserved from history either. It was purpose-built for the movie and has since been moved twice, now sitting at Hellbrunn Palace near Salzburg, where tourists can visit it. Even the Abbey courtyard where Maria lived as a novice was a constructed replica, built by a designer so convincingly that tour guides in Salzburg still sometimes point to it as the genuine location. And that tense graveyard hiding scene, where the family evades Nazi soldiers, that was shot entirely on a studio backlit in Hollywood, nowhere near Austria at all. It feels like it should be an old folk song passed down through generations of Austrians, maybe even close to a national anthem. But Edelweiss was written specifically for the Broadway production by the American songwriting team Rodgers and Hammerstein, along with every other song meant to evoke that Austrian atmosphere. It turned out to be the final song the pair ever wrote together. Oscar Hammerstein passed away not long after the stage musical debuted. Despite being a completely American creation, the song became so beloved and so convincingly authentic, sounding that countless people around the world still assume its genuine Austrian heritage. Back in the 1950s, a German film producer approached Maria von Trapp wanting to adapt her memoir and offered her a flat $10,000 for the rights. When she asked about receiving a cut of future profits, she was told that German law didn't allow royalty payments to non-German citizens, a claim that sounded official enough to believe, especially since she had become an American citizen by that point. Trusting him, She signed away all rights to her own life story. Weeks later, the same producer came back and offered her $9,000 in cash if she'd finalize things immediately, and given how much the family needed the money at the time, she agreed. It was only later that Maria discovered there was no such German law at all. She had simply been misled into giving up her story for far less than it was worth. To their credit, Rogers and Hammerstein weren't obligated to give the Von Trapps anything further, yet they chose to share a portion of the show's earnings anyway. Maria herself later said she held no bitterness about it, insisting the joy the story brought to people mattered more to her than any sum of money. Contrary to the movie's premise, Maria wasn't hired to look after all 7 Von Trapp children at once. In 1926, she was sent from Nonnberg Abbey to tutor a single child, a daughter, also named Maria, who had fallen seriously ill with scarlet fever, the same illness that had claimed the children's mother's life a few years earlier. Because the girl could no longer manage the long walk to school, Captain Von Trapp requested a tutor from the Abbey to teach her at home. A 21-year-old trainee named Maria Augusta Kuchera was chosen for the job, expected to stay just 10 months before returning to complete her path toward becoming a nun. Obviously, life had other plans for her. Screenwriter Ernest Lehman had Julie Andrews in mind from the very start of writing the adaptation, but director Robert Wise initially wanted someone else entirely, considering names like Grace Kelly, by then retired from acting as Princess of Monaco, and Shirley Jones, an established musical star. Everything shifted when Wise caught an early, unreleased screening of Mary Poppins, and was instantly won over by Andrews' screen presence. He agreed with Lehman that she was the right choice. Andrews herself had reservations at first, worried the material might come across as overly sweet, but once she realized the director shared those same concerns and wanted something more grounded and sincere, she signed on, landing a contract worth $225,000, a substantial sum at the time. It turned out to be one of the most celebrated casting decisions in film history. Number 12. The real captain was far warmer than the movie suggests. One detail that reportedly bothered the actual Von Trapp children for years was how coldly their father was portrayed on screen. Yes, he really did use a distinct whistle signal for each child, and yes, the family really did wear matching sailor-style outfits, but he never marched them around like soldiers the way the film implies. By most accounts, George Von Trapp was warm, generous, and easily overwhelmed by the demands of raising a large family rather than distant or authoritarian. If anything, some biographers suggest it was Maria who initially struggled to express affection openly, having grown up in a strict and difficult environment herself. Johannes Von Trapp, the family's youngest child, once described his father in an interview as charming and open, nothing like the rigid military figure audiences saw on screen, and noted that Maria herself tried without success to convince the filmmakers to portray him more accurately. A crucial figure in the family's actual history is completely missing from the movie. After the Great Depression wiped out much of the Von Trapp's wealth, they began renting rooms in their home to make ends meet. One of their tenants was a Catholic priest, Father Franz Wasner, who discovered the family's natural musical talent and gradually shaped them into a genuinely accomplished singing group. He later fled Austria with them and toured alongside the family for years, earning recognition as the true driving force behind their musical success. Because filmmakers felt a priest in that role might distract from Maria's arc, they invented an entirely fictional character, Max Detweiler, to fill that narrative space instead. Maria Augusta Kuchera lost both her parents at a young age and was raised by an uncle known for being harsh. She eventually trained as a teacher, converted to Catholicism, and entered Nonnberg Abbey, intending to become a nun. The film paints her as soft-spoken and gentle, but by her own admission, she was anything but calm inside those convent walls. She once described herself in an interview as having been thoroughly unruly, breaking dishes, talking during mandated silence, dashing around the courtyard, whistling sacred chants that were meant to be solemn, and even climbing up onto the rooftop. The real Maria was lively, stubborn, and often a handful, a far cry from her quiet on-screen counterpart. The film compresses their courtship into roughly a year, but the real timeline was quite different. They actually married in 1927, more than a decade before the family fled Austria. George was 25 years older than Maria, and their relationship didn't begin as a sweeping romance. He wanted her to remain in the household not simply as a governess, but as a mother figure for his children. And when he asked her to take on that permanent role, she accepted, though she later admitted that if he had proposed marriage outright at first, she might have said no. Her initial motivation was devotion to the children rather than romantic love, but genuine affection between her and George developed steadily as the years went on. The film's climax shows the family scrambling over mountains with suitcases and instruments to escape the Nazis, but historical records tell a far calmer story. The real escape, confirmed through interviews and archival records, was quiet and carefully arranged. They left Austria openly during the daytime by train, presenting the trip as an ordinary journey and telling people they were simply heading to America to perform. They weren't alone either. Their musical director, Father Wasner, and their secretary traveled with them, though in the film that role was folded into the fictional Max Detweiler character, who stays behind in the story. From Austria, they moved to Italy. George held Italian citizenship due to where he was born, then on to London before finally sailing to the United States, where they toured as the Trapp Family Singers and eventually settled in Stowe, Vermont, opening a lodge that their descendants still run today. The movie shows a household dripping in luxury, staffed and worry-free, but the real Von Trapps faced serious financial hardship. When the Great Depression hit and their bank failed, much of the family's wealth vanished. Unable to keep their large staff, they let most of them go and started renting out rooms just to get by. Turning to public performance for income wasn't an easy choice for George, who reportedly found it painful to watch his family perform for strangers, not out of snobbery, but out of a desire to protect their privacy. Necessity won out, though, and the family began performing at local festivals, eventually taking first place in a major Austrian singing competition in 1936. A turning point that opened doors internationally and ultimately helped them build a new life in America. The 7 children portrayed in the film, with their invented personalities and now famous names like Liesel and Gretel, don't match the real family at all. George's actual children, from oldest to youngest, were Rupert, Agath, Maria, Werner, Hedwig, Johanna, and Martina. The girl who inspired the story, incidentally, shared her tutor's first name. One of George's daughters was also named Maria. In the film, the oldest child is depicted as a 16-year-old girl. In reality, the eldest, Rupert, was already a grown man in his late 20s and working as a doctor by the time the family left Austria. Contrary to how the movie frames things, George Von Trapp wasn't a stern figure who banned music from the household. In truth, he and his first wife raised their children surrounded by music long before Maria ever entered their lives. The family's shared love of singing was already well established. Maria simply became part of a musical household rather than introducing music to a silent one. The film frames Maria and George's wedding as happening right as Nazi influence closes in on Austria in 1938, giving their union a sense of urgency. In reality, they married on November 26, 1927, over a decade earlier, when Maria was 22 and George was 47. At the time, there was no political threat looming. Hitler hadn't yet annexed Austria, and their marriage had nothing to do with war. They spent more than 10 years building a life together and raising a family, including 3 more children of their own, long before circumstances forced them to flee. After his first wife Agath passed away in 1922, George was left to raise 7 children alone. Rupert, Agath, Maria Francisca, Werner, Hedwig, Johanna, and Martina. Once he and Maria married in 1927, the couple had 3 more children together, Rosemarie, Eleanor, and Johannes, the last of whom was actually born in Philadelphia after the family had already reached America. None of these 3 younger children appear anywhere in the film, likely trimmed for the sake of narrative simplicity, which means the real Von Trapp family actually totaled 10 children, not 7. Before Christopher Plummer accepted the role of Captain Von Trapp, director Robert Wise considered a striking list of alternatives, including Bing Crosby, Yul Brynner, Sean Connery, and Richard Burton. Wise had his heart set on Plummer after watching his stage work, but Plummer turned the role down multiple times, unconvinced by how the character was written. It took a personal trip from Wise all the way to London, along with promises that the character could be reworked with the screenwriter's help, to finally change Plummer's mind. By the time the deal came together, the studio had already invested well over $1 million just to secure the adaptation rights, agreeing to give the original creative team a share of the eventual profits. 20th Century Fox was in genuine financial trouble heading into the mid-1960s, having poured tens of millions of dollars into the notoriously over-budget production of Cleopatra, a project that had ballooned from an original $2 million budget into something over 20 times that size. When The Sound of Music premiered in 1965, the studio wasn't even confident it would do well, given that musicals had fallen somewhat out of fashion. Instead, audiences embraced it wholeheartedly, and the film became the highest-grossing release of the year. By late 1966, it had climbed even further, becoming the highest-grossing film of all time up to that point.